Okay, in the last video we actually looked at a piece of equipment and we learned how to calculate the cost. Remember, we said the cost of an asset includes all expenditures to get the asset ready for its intended use. So how did we actually record that? So let's look back at that piece of equipment. Now, that equipment actually cost $12,000. Pardon my typo there, it will correct here in just a moment. So we recorded it in the journal as a debit to equipment for $12,000 and a credit to cash for $12,000. So now that we have it in our books, we have to allocate that $12,000 in cost across the asset's useful life. So how do we do that? Well, in order to allocate over its useful life, we actually called that depreciation. Now keep in mind, depreciation is nothing more than the allocation of cost. It has nothing to do with fair value. I know in our society a lot of times we'll talk about an asset that depreciated, for example, a car. The minute you drive it off the lot, it depreciates. They're referring to fair value, a reduction in fair value. In accounting, depreciation is not a reduction in fair value. Depreciation is simply the systematic allocation of cost across the asset's useful life. So keep that in mind when you're looking at or thinking of the term depreciation. Now, when we're talking about depreciation, there's several methods to actually allocate this cost, but we're going to look at three primary methods. The three methods used most in the actual accounting world. One is SL, or straight line. Okay, that's the first method. The second is units of production. And then the third method we call double declining balance. So we've got three methods we're going to look at. We're going to look at the straight line, units of production, and double declining balance. Now this video will primarily look at straight line. So in order to calculate depreciation, what do we need to know? Well, we must know the following. We must know the cost of the asset, and that's the actual cost that we recorded. So remember, that cost included all expenditures to get the asset ready for use. The next thing we need is the salvage value, or the residual value of the asset. Those two terms are interchangeable, so you may hear salvage value or residual value. Salvage value or residual value is simply the amount or the value, what we anticipate the value being of the asset at the end of its life. So for example, if you bought a car today, its residual value would be what you would expect to sell it for, say, 5 years from now at the end of what you consider its life. So that's all residual value or salvage value is. What you think you will be able to get for the asset when you sell it at the end of its useful life. So that brings us to the third thing, the useful life. Well, what is the useful life? Useful life is how many accounting periods the asset will actually bring us benefit. For straight line, it's going to be expressed in years, but it could be expressed in units for other methods like the units of production. So useful life is how long are we going to be able to use this asset. All right. So let's go back here and look at this. Our cost was $12,000. That's what we calculated for the cost of this equipment. Now there's two more pieces of information we need. We need one, the salvage value. Well, let's say the salvage value on this equipment is $1,500. Again, that's what we think we'll be able to sell it for at the end of its useful life. Then the next thing we need to know is useful life. So let's just say that this asset will have a useful life of 5 years. It will benefit 5 years or 5 full accounting periods. Okay? So let's calculate the depreciation for all 5 years of the asset's life, assuming there again that we purchased it on January 1st and that we use the straight line method of depreciation. So if you need to take a moment to pause the video to write this information down, please do so. Alright, so year one, let's look at how we first calculate straight line depreciation. Straight line depreciation is a very straightforward formula. The first thing we start with is the cost of the asset. Again, we know what the cost of the asset is, and then we subtract from the cost the salvage or residual value. Then once we do that, we divide that by the useful life in years. So let's look at this example. Straight line here, we've got the cost of this asset was $12,000. Again, it had a salvage value of $1,500, and then we said it had a useful life of 5 years. So 12,000 minus 1,500 gives us 10,005, and then we divide that by 5, and that gives us straight line depreciation of $2,100. And that $2,100 would actually be the depreciation per year. Okay, so keep that in mind, per year. Per year every 12 months. Alright, so let's make a little chart here. So we've got our year, our depreciation expense, and our accumulated depreciation. So in year 1, we already calculated depreciation expense to be $2,100. Well, on top of that, we have to calculate the accumulated depreciation on the asset. Accumulated depreciation is the sum of all expenses. So for every year you expense, your accumulated depreciation is going to increase. Remember back in Accounting 111 or a prior accounting class when you were covering chapters 2 and 3 and 4, it actually was, accumulated depreciation we learned was a contra asset. It went against the equipment to give us our true value. Okay? In the first year, the depreciation expense will equal the accumulated depreciation, or the accumulated depreciation equals the expense, because the prior year the expense was 0. Now, the cool thing about straight line, once you calculate it for 1 year or one total, you have the full year after that. So year 2, again, you would expense $2,100 more in depreciation expense. Now, that would bring our accumulated depreciation, though, to $4,200. Again, the sum of all year's expense. So you take $2,100 from prior year, plus the $2,100 from this year would give you accumulated depreciation of $4,200. Year 3, again, straight line, it would be $2,100 and bring our accumulated depreciation to $6,300. Year 4, you guessed it, $2,100, straight line, same every full year. And then $8,400 would be our accumulated. And finally, in year 5, we would have $2,100 in expense, and we'd have $10,500 at the end of the asset's life. That's our total accumulated depreciation. Now that we've calculated the depreciation, how would we actually record it in our general journal? Well, to record depreciation, you would look at the end of the period. So this asset was bought on January 1st. We're going to assume that the end of our accounting period is December 31st. We're going to follow the calendar year. So on December 31st, we would need to go in and adjust for depreciation expense. So the way we would record it is we would actually debit depreciation expense, and we would debit for the amount $2,100, the amount we calculated for that year. Then we would go in and we'd hit accumulated depreciation, and we would hit that as a credit for $2,100. So every year after this point, we would make the exact same entry. So every December 31st, we would go in and we would depreciate 1/5 across the 5 years.